At a bank auction in February of 1984, Frank Sutter stood beside the tractor he used to brag about, and watched a stranger buy it for less than half of what he still owed. The whole county was there, pretending not to stare. Across the road, on a cold strip of Kansas ground, Elias Brenner was spreading compost behind two Belgian mares named June and Belle. The wagon creaked, the horses steamed in the winter air, and the men at the auction still called him backward. That was the last year, they said it loud. Elias Brenner had bought 46 acres outside Mill Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1975. Not prime land, not bad land either. A sloping piece of mixed ground with a spring-fed draw, a tired orchard, a barn with one side leaning north, and a farmhouse that had been empty long enough for mice to think they had inherited it. He paid $18,700 for it, $7,000 down, the rest on a note from the Prairie State Bank. The loan was small by county standards. To Elias, it felt like a stone tied to his chest. He was 37 years old and had never owned a field before. His father had rented ground in 3 counties and lost all 3 places without losing a lawsuit. A rented man can work a farm for 20 years and still leave with the same truck he arrived in. Elias had seen that happen. He had watched his mother carry jars of canned peaches out of a house they had painted with their own hands, because the owner wanted the acreage for cattle. So when Elias signed the papers for 46 acres, he did not think he had bought a business. He thought he had bought a place his children could not be ordered away from. His neighbor on the east side was Frank Sutter. Frank farmed 1,800 acres, and believed land was only serious if you needed a radio to find the other end of it. He owned 4 tractors, 2 grain trucks, a new combine with a cab like an office, and a line of equipment so wide it looked, from a distance, like a small invasion. Frank was not cruel to Elias. Cruelty would have required too much attention. He waved when he passed. He offered a few tips that were really warnings. He told Elias where to buy diesel, where not to buy seed, which banker could be squeezed, and which extension man knew the county best. Then he looked at the 2 Belgian mares standing in Elias's pasture, and smiled like a man trying not to laugh at a child. June and Belle were not young. June was 14, deep-chested and calm, with a white blaze down her face. Belle was 12, darker, sharper, and smart enough to open a gate if the latch was lazy. Elias had bought the pair from a retired hay farmer in Riley County for $420, and a promise that they would never go to slaughter. By 1975, draft horses on a working grain and market farm were considered sentiment, poverty, or both. Frank Sutter called them hay burners. The younger men at the co-op called them Elias's antique engine. Someone once asked him, in front of a line of farmers waiting on coffee, whether he was planning to farm or perform in a parade. Elias did not answer. He paid for his seed, loaded salt blocks into the truck, and went home. The truth was not that Elias hated machinery. He owned a small used tractor for belt work, hauling, and emergency jobs. He was not trying to live in a photograph. He was trying to keep his land. The difference matters. 2 years before he bought the farm, Elias had worked a fencing job for a widow named Nora Pike. Nora was 74 then, bent at the shoulder, sharp in the eye, and still running 31 acres of vegetables, oats, hay, hens, and 1 Jersey cow with less cash trouble than men farming 50 times her ground. She had no patience for speeches. Not praise the old ways, because they were old. She praised what still worked after the bank, the weather, and the market had all taken their turn. Elias spent 9 days fixing her west fence. He stayed for coffee on the 10th. After that, he came back whenever he could. Nora taught with chores. She showed him how a hoof marks the surface without squeezing the life out of the layer beneath it. She pushed a spade into her garden and then into a neighbor's field, and let him feel the difference before she named it. She poured water over 2 clods of soil in pie tins, and made him watch one crumble like cake, other seal over like clay. A farm has a pulse, she told him. If you run faster than that pulse every year, you do not get ahead, you only borrow from the part you cannot see. That sentence stayed with him. You only borrow from the part you cannot see. Men like Frank borrowed from banks. Elias understood that. What Nora wanted him to understand was that a man could borrow from his soil too. He could borrow structure, moisture, organic matter, root depth, insect balance, and the quiet labor of worms and microbes. The loan came without a signature. That was what made it dangerous. Nobody called you in after one bad decision. The field just stopped carrying you. 10 seasons later, when Elias took possession of his 46 acres, he built the operation around one rule. Nothing leaves the farm without something coming back. He planted oats on the ridge and alfalfa on the better slope. He kept a truck garden near the spring draw where the soil was dark and forgiving. He fenced hogs behind the barn and moved them from pen to pen so they worked waste into bedding. He ran hens through the orchard after harvest to clean dropped fruit and scratch for pests. He sold eggs, beans, tomatoes, sweet corn, pork, and small bundles of herbs at the Mill Creek Saturday market. He seeded cover where Frank would have left bare stubble. He spread manure, saved straw, composted bedding, rotated feed, and tracked every dollar in a ledger his wife Inez kept in a blue school notebook. It did not look impressive from the county road. That was one of the reasons people missed it. Frank's fields looked like power. Straight rows, wide machines, chemical certainty, corn and wheat in blocks so large the horizon seemed planned by him personally. Elias's place looked busy and irregular. Hay here, beans there, oats on a slope, squash near the orchard, hens behind netting, hogs under a shed roof, 2 heavy mares walking in a rhythm older than the county courthouse. The extension agent called Elias's layout inefficient. He wrote the word down in his ledger. Then he wrote beside it, efficient for what? In 1976, Frank had a good year. In 1977, he had another. Grain prices held well enough, land values kept climbing, and lenders were still speaking the language of expansion. Frank bought an additional quarter section north of town, and financed a new planter with wings wide enough to make other men stop and look. The co-op treated Frank like the future. They treated Elias like a man who had stepped out of the future's way. But the costs were changing before most people admitted they were changing. Diesel was no longer a background expense. Fertilizer no longer felt cheap. Operating loans that had once been unpleasant became dangerous. Men who had built their confidence on acres began to learn that an acre could produce grain, and still not produce freedom, if enough people had a claim on the harvest before it left the field. Frank answered tighter margins with more acres. That was what the system taught him to do. If profit per acre shrinks, plant more acres. If the note grows, chase more gross income. If the machine is too large to sit idle, feed it land. Elias answered tighter margins by closing loops. The mares did not drink diesel. The alfalfa fed the soil and the animals. The animals fed the compost, fed the vegetables. The vegetables brought cash before grain checks came in. The hens turned orchard waste into eggs. The hogs turned scraps and grain screenings into pork. The market customers paid cash in small bills that Inez folded into envelopes by category. Bank, seed, roof, children, winter. It was not romantic. It was bookkeeping with dirt under its nails. By 1979, the difference between the two farms had started to show in ways a man could deny if denial was all he had left. Frank's Westfield crusted badly after spring rain. Water ran across it in silver sheets before it went down. In August, The leaves curled by noon and stayed that way. Crops still came off. It always came off. But the numbers were softer, and the cure was always another input. More nitrogen, more horsepower, a deeper pass, a faster pass, another loan to cover the pass. Elias's fields did not win any county yield contest. They simply refused to panic. In wet weeks, the ground opened and swallowed rain instead of sending it away. In dry weeks, the plants waited longer before showing stress. The rows were not perfect, but the roots were honest. The alfalfa stood thick. The oats lodged less. The vegetables held through heat that burned out other gardens. His corn looked modest from the road, and better every 10 steps into the field. The part Frank could not see from his tractor cab was the part that mattered. The soil had changed. A shovel slice from Elias's ground held together like bread. It smelled alive. It carried roots deep enough to make a dry spell less frightening. Wormholes stitched the profile from top to bottom. Water did not sit on it like a stranger. It entered. No one at the co-op measured that. The bank measured payments, and Frank's payments were becoming a weather system of their own. By the winter of 1980, interest rates were no longer background noise. They were the loudest thing in every farm kitchen. Notes renewed at numbers that made men set down their coffee and stare at the wall. Land that had looked like a ladder began to look like a ledge. Men who had borrowed against rising values discovered that rising values can turn around without asking permission. Frank sold a grain truck first. He told people he was upgrading the fleet. Then he delayed payment on fertilizer. Then he sold the North Quarter he had bought only a few years earlier. Then came the summer of 1982. It was the kind of summer that makes farmers old in one season. Hot wind, short rain, dust at the edge of every road, corn firing from the bottom, wheat light in the head, cattle standing in ponds where ponds still existed. Frank needed a good crop. Not an average crop. Not an honest crop. A good one. His whole structure required the weather to cooperate with the bank's arithmetic. The weather did not cooperate. His compacted fields shed the little rain they received. The roots stayed shallow where the soil had been pressed into a hard, airless plate. The fertilizer was there, but the plant could not use what it could not reach. By August, Frank drove past some of his own ground without slowing down, because there was nothing useful to see. Elias had damage too. The drought touched everybody. Just a late planting of beans near the south fence. The pasture went short. The spring dropped lower than he had ever seen it, but the farm bent instead of breaking. Alfalfa roots went down, mulch held, cover held. Orchard hens found shade. The market garden yielded less, but did not quit. His oats had come off early enough to give him feed. The hogs were fewer that year because Elias had seen the feed price coming, and cut numbers before pride could argue. When Inez closed the ledger in November, they had not made much. But they had made it. That was the whole miracle, if you want to call it a miracle. They made it without asking the bank for permission to survive. Frank did not. The Prairie State Bank posted the first legal notice in March of 1983. By then everyone in Mill Creek knew pieces of the story, and nobody knew how to speak of it without feeling the cold edge of their own risk. Frank Sutter had been the man people pointed to when they wanted to describe success. Now his equipment sat in rows beside the machine shed, with lot numbers wired to the steering wheels. The auction was set for February. Elias went because not going would have been a statement, and he did not want to make one. He stood near the edge of the crowd, with his hands in his coat pockets. June and Belle were back home in the barn. Inez had told him to take the truck, not the wagon, because grief does not need witnesses making jokes around it. The auctioneer's voice hit the cold air fast and bright. Men who had once asked Frank for advice now watched his life split into purchasable parts. The combine went first, then a disc, then the planter with the wide wings, then the tractor Frank loved most, the big one with the cab, the one he had polished before County Fair week as if paint could prove judgment. Frank stood behind it, and did not look at anyone. That was when Elias understood something he had not expected. He did not feel vindicated. He felt warned, because losing land is not a lesson you cheer for, even when it proves your teacher right. Elias knew too much about leaving a place with your hands empty. He knew that a foreclosure notice is printed on paper, but lands on a family like weather. 2 weeks after the auction, Frank's pickup came up Elias's drive. It was near dusk. The barn lights were not electric bright, just 2 old bulbs hanging under dusty shades. June shifted in her stall. Bell stamped once. Inez was washing jars at the sink when Frank knocked. He had taken his cap off before Elias opened the door. That small fact told Elias almost everything. Frank asked if Elias could help seed a 20-acre bottom field that Frank was still renting from his sister. The bank had taken most of the equipment. He had a little ground left, a little seed, and not much else. He could pay after harvest if Elias would wait. Elias did not answer at the door. He said, "Come in where it's warm." They sat at the kitchen table. Inez poured coffee. The blue ledger was closed beside a stack of market tags. Outside, the horses moved in the barn with the patient weight of creatures who did not know they had been the subject of county jokes for 8 years. Around the kitchen the way a man looks at evidence after the verdict has already been read. The jars, the envelopes, the children's boots by the wall, the seed catalogs marked in pencil, the old harness cleaned and hung where it would dry. Nothing grand, nothing wasted. He finally said, "I thought you were afraid to grow." Elias looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I was afraid to owe." Frank stared into his cup. That was the first true sentence either of them had ever spoken to the other. They made an agreement. A fair price. Half due after harvest. No speeches. In April, Elias took June and Belle to the bottom field and worked it slowly enough that Frank, standing by the fence, looked embarrassed at first. Then he looked interested. The horses did not sink. They did not smear the wet ground. Elias waited at the turns. He adjusted the lines with 2 fingers. He watched the soil, not the clock. Frank watched him watching. After an hour, Frank said, "How did you know all this would matter?" Elias did not give him a story about instinct. Instinct was too cheap a word for what Nora Pike had taught him. He did not say he was smarter. He had made mistakes, too. He had lost plantings, misread rain, bought bad seed, trusted a fence that failed in the night. He said, "I had someone show me what a field looks like before it fails." Frank nodded once. Not because he understood everything. Because he understood enough to be ashamed. That spring, the county extension office sent a soil specialist to Elias's farm. Not because Elias requested it. Because a banker's son had taken a class in agronomy at Kansas State, and had heard a professor talk about soil organic matter, infiltration, and compaction. And suddenly the strange little farm outside Mill Creek sounded less strange. The specialist took samples from the ridge, the draw, the orchard, and the vegetable ground. He counted worm casts in a square foot of soil, and stopped counting sooner than he expected, because there were too many. He pushed a probe into Elias's field after rain, and then tried the same thing in a neighboring field, and came back with mud on his boots and a different expression on his face. The report used careful words. High organic matter, excellent aggregate stability, strong infiltration, low compaction, resilient moisture profile. Elias read it at the table while Inez made bread. The word that held him was resilient. Not rich, not modern, not efficient. Resilient. Closed the report and went to the barn. June died the following winter at 23. She lay down in clean straw before dawn, and did not get up again. Elias found her when he came to feed. Belle stood near the stall door, quiet in a way that made the whole barn feel empty.
Elias sat beside June with one hand on her neck until the morning light came through the cracks in the boards. A horse does not know she saved a farm. That is not how animals think. But Elias knew. He knew every row she had walked, every spring morning she had waited for his command, every wet field she had crossed without tearing it open.
Every season she had turned fuel into fertility instead of smoke. He buried her on the rise above the spring draw, where the orchard windbreak could lean toward her. He bought another horse that March. Not because he was loyal to the past, because the system still worked. Over the next 10 years, Mill Creek changed the way all farm counties changed. Some families left. Some land was bought by operators big enough to survive the shakeout. Some men never recovered the part of themselves the auctioneer sold in pieces. The crisis did not turn everyone into Elias. And Elias never pretended it should have. A tractor is not a sin. A big farm is not automatically foolish. But debt has a hunger. Compacted soil has a memory. A monoculture has no second plan. And a farmer who mistakes speed for strength can reach the end of a good decade, with nothing underneath him when the bad decade arrives. Elias kept farming the 46 acres. His daughter Ruth took over the ledgers and made them sharper. His son Daniel studied animal science and came home with new words for old observations. Inez expanded the market stand into a weekly route with restaurants in 2 towns. Frank Sutter kept his 20-acre rental and helped Elias during haying after he found work at the grain elevator. The 2 men never became sentimental friends. That would have been too easy for a story, and too false for life. They became useful to each other. That was better. He learned to read a field by walking into it. He learned that mud tells on you. He learned that a root pulled from shallow ground is not unlucky. It is evidence. He learned that a farmer can lose land long before the bank files papers, if he spends 10 years teaching the soil not to hold him. By 1991, younger farmers were coming to Elias's place on Saturdays. Not crowds, not tours with name tags, just men and women in work boots standing at the edge of a field while Elias turned over a spadeful of earth and let them see what patience looked like when it had a physical form. He never told them to copy him. He told them to count what they were not counting. Count the interest before you count the acres. Count the diesel before you count the yield. Count the water that enters the soil, not just the rain that falls on it. Count the life below the root line. Count the cost of needing everything to go right. And then count what happens when one thing goes wrong. That was the lesson Frank had learned too late. That was the lesson Nora Pike had given Elias early enough. Years later, after Belle was gone, and the barn had been straightened, and the orchard had grown thick enough to hide the roof from the county road, Elias found Nora's old pie tins hanging on a nail in his tool room, kind she had used to show him the difference between soil that drinks and soil that seals. He took them down, filled one with soil from his vegetable plot, and one with soil from a rented field down the road, and poured water over both while his granddaughter watched. One clod opened, the other hardened. The child looked up at him and asked, why? Elias smiled. Because there are questions a family must keep asking if it wants to keep land. He said, because one of them was treated like it was alive. That is what the county missed when it laughed at the horses. It was never really about the horses. About a man who understood that ownership without restraint is just another form of renting. The bank can take a farm in 1 year. Bad soil takes it slower. Pride takes it faster than both. Elias Brenner did not beat Frank Sutter by being old-fashioned. He beat the system that broke Frank, by refusing to let the system define success for him. 46 acres, 2 Belgian mares, a kitchen ledger, a market stand, a family that stayed, soil that could take rain and hold through heat. A farm small enough for one man to notice what was changing. and strong enough to carry him when the county's bigger promises began to fail. At the end, the land made the argument. Not loudly. Not all at once. But in roots. In water. In a field that did not quit. And in the silence of men who had once laughed at walking speed, until walking speed was the only pace left that still made sense.